Hey everybody. We're still about a week behind, so keep that in mind for our schedule and whatnot. I think that our schedule originally had us working on midterm stuff, but that's going to be pushed back a week. I think that would put your midterm paper at like October 25th. October 25th? Well, I'll post it to our class website. I'll look at the calendar and make sure my dates are right. So today we're doing chapter 8. Your midterm exam will be in the first 10 chapters, and chapter 8 is going to take us probably 2 days because there's a fair amount still to wrap up. Sorry, I'm just a little headachy today. Any general questions on anything before I just start talking about chapter 8 and languages? Well, all right. I was noticing actually looking through chapter 8 that some of this info is actually mentioned in the previous 2 chapters. That's the kind of the unusual structure of this book is they have these units that have multiple chapters, so there'll be a bit of that, but usually the thought is if something is repeated, well, a student will remember it even better if it's set in a different type of context. So language families, well, these are related languages, right? And languages, like all kinds of different things we study, diffuse around the world in all kinds of different ways. There's less and less languages through time. A lot of languages are dying out around the world. So an isolate is an isolated language with no known historic or linguistic relationship with any other known language, right? Those are lots of ones that are subsiding. I have a map of languages here. Looking at this map, you can see a couple of different patterns, right? Some that obviously come to mind are, well, the spread of these languages to these areas, right, due to a history of colonization. Lots of these areas that are gray are places with indigenous languages. Indigenous languages are the ones that are tending to be used less and less, right? And that's for a number of different reasons. During the colonial period, for example, well, these countries forced the population to speak the language of the colonizers, right? What else do we have going on this map here? We have what we talked about a little bit before, the Bantu expansion. Some very successful agriculture, tropical agriculture was invented here, and then that population kind of spread all over. I would say a kind of interesting thing in this section here, well, you had a number of empires basically located here that were very successful, and for a while, this whole map would have been just this shade of yellow going across here. But then much later, well, Russia colonized in this direction, right? And so they basically cut a swath through here. That's kind of, how you see these different languages in different places. It's very often is what's happening is you'll have different groupings kind of cut through different areas, and then you'll see kind of the remnants of different areas here and there. Let's see if there's anything other big trends. Oh, I would say you see this Uralic family up here. This is the actual, well, indigenous European language. That was a very long time ago, but since then, there's been multiple languages that have just kind of come up through here through time. So you can see that all things are kind of open to interpretation of different languages, right? Even the noises that animals make. No, you would never specifically really think that you would have this much variety for people just describing the sounds that come out of different animals. Some of them are similar, obviously, but you can see plenty are quite different. Language family trees. Usually, these obviously mean languages that are more or less related to each other. We can usually see how related languages are through things like cognates. If anyone has studied a foreign language, Usually the first words you do are cognates. Language branches and language groups. Speaking of cognates, so if you know a Romance language, for example, well, it'll be easier for you to learn the other languages because they're more similar, right? So this is one of the reasons why, especially if you're reading. If you could read Spanish and you're looking at an Italian text, you can read lots of the words, right? So it's quite similar. Let's make stuff about that stuff. Again, these languages spread about usually with people who bring those languages with them, right? That's not always the case, but that was the case in the Bantu, which we looked a little bit in Guns, Germs, and Steel, about how that language family basically spread across. As that group spread across, and it would either kind of mix with different groups, it would adopt some of their words and not others, and then that group would spread out, and they would then adopt some of the population's words in a new place and not others. And so even if you have one language, it could have lots of many different kind of offshoots, especially if it travels across a long period of time. So the Bantu expansion itself of this one group kind of taking over most of Africa, that was like 5,000 years of time, right? And a lot of the colonization that we're looking at, could have been very quick processes, right? As we saw when we had places that were being overthrown by different colonial powers. Categories of languages. We have our own dialect and language. Obviously, it's English, but through time, all languages evolve. All languages start taking different shapes and whatnot. When we talk about things that kind of divide countries or divide up territories, it's often things like that, cultural norms that just start to diverge. I think I showed you a map before about soda and pop and stuff. This is a different visual. Just kind of showing that geographic split. Well, spoken languages in the world, again, usually these are signs of very successful people who bring their languages to all kinds of different areas of the world. And any one of these, they have an origin point to a very small point. And so Arabic, for example, right? Arabic in large areas of the world, well, if you study its history and whatnot, there's just a very small area in northern Arabia that language group started, right? And as that group became successful and moved elsewhere, it brought that with it, as well as often cultural norms. Not all languages are brought about due to empires taking over areas, especially modern day. There's just different kinds of pressures to use languages, especially if possibly that's a language of business in a local area. Everyone might want to pick up enough of it so that they could do business transactions. Of course, if you have populations of areas where that population is growing, then the language users of that population grow. So some ideas about the Indo-European language, which is, English is part of that language group. You would think that there might be some very well documented source of this, but these things get very lost through time. There's a couple of different hypotheses. Kurgan hypothesis suggests that this whole language family started out, well, as you can see, in kind of Russian-Ukraine area, although, well, it changed as it went everywhere else. And that theory is basically through conquering and taking over different areas. And then you also have the Anatolian his theory, Indo-European family, originated in Anatolia region, and the belief with this one is that as agriculture kind of spread, the language associated with it and a number of the people spread around at the same time. In truth, although there are these kind of competing theories, in truth it's likely that they're both somewhat true, that they both, and that these kind of original language groups kind of merged as they moved around. Very often, geographic features can be a big divide between languages. This is an area that is very, very mountainous, right? And you have, influence of Russia, which is spreading this region, and it would often force people to speak Russian and adopt that language. But little areas within the mountains that did not get much circulation, not only did they not take up that language, but even local languages really didn't cross these mountainous barriers that well, right? And so they would kind of all evolve in their own unique ways and be very differentiated. Diffusion of English. Again, there was a big empire, the British Empire, that spread around everywhere. English itself is a bit of an unusual language. That's because, you have Romance languages in general in the Southern Europe, and you have Germanic languages in general in Northern Europe. And through time, Britain was taken over by these different places over and over and over. And each time, those places, they would basically require their language be used. And so when you would have another empire that would come in and take over, and Britain was taken over by many places, many times, each time they would keep some of the words from those different empires, just because that's the language they had been using. So English itself has something like 3 to 5 times as many words as most other languages, because it's kept all these different words from different, very different kind of language roots. English language, similar to other languages, things that are in the natural landscape are very influential in local people's languages. So for example, England itself being a pretty flat place and a place that gets lots of rain means it has lots of water formations and flowing water, and so thus the English language compared to other languages has a lot of words for this type of thing. You would see the same thing elsewhere. Languages that are in a mountainous region have lots of words for different types of mountains, desert regions, different words for desert features. And there's a modern day shift, especially in the use of English, but not just English, other colonial languages where a lot of places are trying to slowly go back to using terms and words that were the original names of things. And this is a bit controversial. Even all of India itself is looking at maybe changing its name, but it's controversial because the name that it wants to go back to was not the name for the entire country, it was for a part of the country. And so, maybe it's a bit like if the US was gonna change its name to Texas, you would think plenty of people who aren't in Texas would be like, no, I don't think so. Cities themselves, though, less argumentative. One of the language families that kind of has the largest geography, although one of the smaller amount of actual speakers, as you can see, this came about through lots of migration around and through the interacting of the populations in these regions. Now these had lots of different kind of offshoots and variety through time, just because these different islands and whatnot are somewhat isolated, even though there is communication and contact between them. They have formed distinct little groupings of the same language group, but that have kind of narrowed down through time. Yeah, I would just say natural geographic boundaries are often a big reason for a variety of languages, just because historically people have not interacted that much. Modern day, since so much interaction is online, it's a bit of a different thing, right? When countries choose their official language, this might be more controversial than one would think, right? So, for example, Indonesia, when they became independent, Indonesia itself is a series of many different islands. Do I got Indonesia on the map? Not the best maps. Well, in a nutshell, there was thought about, well, what to do, what name to choose. Sometimes the choice is, well, should we keep the language of a colonizer since everyone was made to understand it and know it? And it's one of those things where, in this situation, it was the people who were a privileged group who knew the language very well, and so the rest of the population didn't really want to choose that language. Plus, it was a language of an oppressor, right? So it's like, well, we don't want to choose that language. Well, the actual native Indonesian language was a language that basically everyone in the region knew some of, and so, but no one was really that much of an expert of it besides a very small group that did not really have a lot of political power. So it's felt if they adopted that as their national language, more people would be able to use it, and it wouldn't specifically privilege any kind of one island or area, right? Malaysia had a very different circumstance going. Population of Malaysia includes about 35% of the populations are Chinese, and also that Chinese population is very wealthy. So the Malaysian government itself was looking at, well, what language should we use? That might have been a thought, right, at first, of like, well, this is the language of business and the language of people who kind of have all the financial power locally, but instead decided to use English because it was a language that plenty of people knew. It didn't privilege the Chinese population. The feeling was that if Chinese was made the national language, well, then are you just a part of China then, technically? But there's a variety in most of these places that I'm looking at, that I'm showing you. They usually are multilingual. They usually have multiple languages going on at a time, kind of all competing for power a bit. See, when I mentioned that some things repeat from the past chapters, I think lingua franca was brought up before. Common language between speakers of different languages for the purpose of commerce, trade, and diplomacy. Very often this can be a pidgin language. A pidgin language is, well, actually we heard a little bit of that in Guns, Gems, and Steel when the people in Papua New Guinea were speaking English. They usually just had like a couple words, but it was enough basically to communicate basics. And Jared Diamond himself, when he's communicating back, rather than using like complicated English words, he also used just key phrases and terms that he knew people knew, right? Regionally, English has become a bit of a lingua franca, and again, in no small part because of the internet and English itself being used so much on the internet. And of course, the lineage of that is the United States is one of the main countries and populations who do things on the internet, right? Like toponyms, I think we talked about too, but they bring it up again in this chapter. Toponyms, those are phrases for places that are descriptive, basically. And so I usually use the example of, when suburbanization became the big thing in the U.S. and that part of our development, a lot of the suburbs would pick names that evoked specific vision of a perfect place to go. So lots of places would put park in their name, right? Or heights in their name. some examples of some more specific language groups and whatnot. As you can see, well, you have the Han Chinese, right, which was a small ethnicity. I think they were here-ish originally, but they've spread throughout, including regions that did not have that as their main language. And part of that is a lineage of way past empires, right, that China still has control of parts of. You can see the remnants here also of the Mongolian Empire, right, language group was this whole area, but now it's kind of been pushed back quite a bit because it's Mongolia itself, not a major power anymore. This is the geography that it used to cover, right? And empires, the Mongolian Empire included, when they would take over places, they would require everyone to speak that language, right? Another example, Russia, right? The Russian language and the Russian people themselves, they had a very small core area that was just around Moscow, right? And as they expanded and they colonized, and I know people don't think of the areas right around here as anything other than Russian, but they had their own cultures and languages and things. This process of forcing the Russian language across Russia, it's called Russification, and actually that term works for any country, and so there was a Germanization when Germany was taking over areas like, have people ever heard of Prussia? Prussia, maybe? People, what's their language like? Anyone know anything about Prussia? That's because it don't exist. That's because it had Germanization. Germany took it over, and in Prussia they said, well, you're gonna speak German now, you're German people. Your national dish that you would eat, you're not allowed to make that anymore. National songs, schooling in your old language, you're getting rid of all of it and you're just adopting all German norms. And well, when you force people to do that, after a couple of generations, then people just think of that area as Germany. Similar thing happened with Russia, where you had this huge territory that people just think of as Russian. And you do actually have parts here and there that have previous languages that basically the Russification process was most recent, and so it's been least done. But as you can see, this process took a long period of time. European languages, I talked a bit about Romance languages being similar to each other. But again, you have things like the Basque region, which has a language that is completely unconnected to any of these languages, because it is from an indigenous group that was there before any of these other groups. And again, we think of these countries as kind of being these eternal entities and whatnot, but these themselves, like France, used to be little kingdoms that would all have their own different languages, but it was through a process of expansion and merge and forcing places to assimilate that these became the countries that we kind of identify very easily today. You could also see little bits of the Celtic language here and there, right? Well, the Celtic people, this used to be all Celtic people, right? They came after these people, but way before a number of other people. And you can see there's still kind of like the parts that were assimilated the last are the ones that still use that language somewhat. But again, like I said, it's people picture this kind of one identity and this one people, but this it has had migration after migration after migration, and people taking over and over again. Yeah. Endangered languages around the world. In general, these are areas where you have a higher percentage of indigenous populations that still exist, and so they're still speaking those languages. They're endangered because obviously there's pressures from these different companies for people to assimilate. Very often the younger generation they don't really use the language other than to talk to their parents maybe or grandparents. And if that's the case, you lose that language. A lot of these places around the world have started specific projects to try to video record their languages and trying to get some permanent records of the languages before they're completely not used. Especially languages that have no written form, which there are many, because you don't need to be able to write it to have a language to exist. But if there's no written form, then it really is just the few speakers, right, who still have it. And as that generation gets older, and as the younger generation is more likely to take up the language of other local things going on, especially whoever's in power, those things are kind of going away. Somewhat of a better map of some of the older language groups. These are basically the places that have been less assimilated, right? Slightly more detailed map of these regions. Very often these are populations that are maybe in the mountain areas or areas that are a bit cut off from other areas, and so there was less kind of assimilation happening. As you can see, a lot of different information can be shown on maps, kind of depending on the thing you're wanting to map or whatnot. So if you're looking at, when you look at South America, right, and you have Portuguese and you have Spanish. Well, the Pope, many years ago, there was a fight between Portugal and Spain about who would be able to have what proportions of South America, and the Pope at the time split it evenly on the map that they had at the time. As you can see, that line is not really an even line through there. The Brazil, basically, as a country, this territory. Now, as you can see, Spanish itself has kind of moved in quite a bit, and I would say on the ground here, people who are Portuguese speakers, they speak it in a way much more similar to how Spanish is spoken, and that actually causes a problem when people from Brazil go back to Portugal, because they've evolved in such different areas that there's communication difficulties, even though it's technically still the same language. The spoken version sounds a lot different. The written version is still very similar, right? And this is just showed an evolution of Spanish through time in different countries. Argentina had a huge amount of Italian settlers, and so their version of Spanish has a lot of kind of Italian accent to it. So if you're there, you would hear it spoken, and you might think to yourself, that sounds Italian to me, but it's more like Spanish with an Italian accent. In Spain itself, the influences of Spanish have changed because, you had Moorish population, Islamic population, Arab population who had control of the area for hundreds of years, right? And even though that changed up, a lot of people still use the same words for these things, right? And so then you have a word that was put in by one group. Those words are still used on the opposite side of the planet due to that country that had been colonizing other places. Well, all right. Plenty of time to do some small group work this time. As you can see, I have some kind of complicated questions for you today, but I'm going to come out and do the card thing, get you into groups to work on these. But as I said, plenty of time today, so I should be able to do these. People who are not here today. All right, looks like the biggest group is clubs.